Cool. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about basically hacking in Guile, programming in Guile. It's kind of more of an introductory session. We'll cover that in a second. I had to make some slight adaptations to my kind of full screen setup, but hopefully it should work out. We'll see how it goes. So first of all, yeah, my name is Alex Sassmanshausen. I kind of work for PTFS Europe, and I get to work on a library management system which is used by public and academic libraries, which is free software. So I'm very lucky in that respect. So getting started. Just to gauge kind of the experience in the room, like who here has programmed in Guile before? Wow, okay. So yeah, this is an introductory session. Some of it you may already know. But so you've programmed in Guile. Who here is, has done like a larger project or anything like that in Guile? Like is that okay? So that's fewer. Okay, that's good. And who feels really comfortable working in Guile? Okay. Okay. So even the Guile maintainer is like, maybe. Okay, so I would say I'm relatively comfortable in Guile, for sure. But so maybe what we're going to cover in this presentation is like the bare basics, and then kind of maybe seeing how we can kind of improve our workflow. And I guess maybe also like towards the end, if we have time, hopefully, we might be able to kind of share some ideas or share some tips about stuff that we do or workflows we have. We'll see where we go. Down here, this will become relevant later. You should be able to see my key commands. This is when I will be using Emacs in a second, but for now it's probably not that important. So, first things about Guile, this is probably I can skip, but basically it's a scheme implementation, which is a Lisp dialect, and that means that there's obviously lots of parentheses, which are wonderful creatures. And you can also use this thing called Wisp, written by someone called Arne. And that's kind of a way, and I think there's a presentation about that later on. It's kind of a way to kind of essentially turn scheme into a less parenthesis language, which is quite neat actually, to be honest, the fact that it's possible. But I like my parentheses. So installing Guile on Debian-like distros is super easy, and on Geeks and Geeks.c, of course, is super easy as well. So it's straightforward, you can skip that. A quick aside, so one of the big things about scheme languages and Lisp in general, I guess, are REPLs. And basically they stand for read, eval, print loops. So they're basically just interactive prompts, much like your shell. And it's just kind of a place to evaluate your commands. And most kind of high-level languages nowadays have them. At work, I program mainly in Perl and also some PHP, neither of which are particularly known for their REPLs. So that's one of the reasons why I like working in Guile, is because I have access to the REPL, because it's great. So, but yeah, most languages, most kind of high-level languages nowadays probably have them. So normally firing up the REPL is super easy. It's as easy as kind of once Guile is installed, kind of just executing the Guile command and you get a REPL. We already saw that before in Ricardo's presentation. By default, it's a bit Spartan. Like, I can obviously, execute commands. Sure, why not? Let's go with it. Yeah, so it's displayed there. You can see it. I should probably kind of go for. So I've just kind of tried to press, you can see it on here, I've just tried to press the up arrow thinking, oh, I could get my history up, but no, because the standard REPL doesn't come with history. So it's, like I say, it's a bit Spartan, but you can basically use it, it's a REPL. Okay. There we go. So yeah, it's a bit Spartan by default, which is a bit meh, but we can improve it. Because by default, Guile comes with basically a library which is called readline. So first of all, Guile kind of executes like Emacs basically evaluates kind of a startup file, which is in Guile's case written in pure Guile, and it comes with a standard library called readline. And you can also, there's a separate project called Colorize, written by Nala, which is kind of just adds pretty colors. So I'm quickly gonna enable those. That didn't work. There we go. There we go. That's better. So I've just kind of tweaked my pre-prepared Guile ini file, and now running it. First of all, this is just basically like, a demonstration that it's a pure scheme file, so you can basically write whatever you want in there. If you want to do some kind of fancy computations before the REPL fires up, that's fine, you can do that. But the main thing is, I've enabled the colorize library, so you've got pretty colors there now. And I also have a history now. And as part of a history read line also provides obviously kind of backward search and stuff like that. So already the REPL immediately becomes a lot better. So out of the box installing Guile, if you want to use Guile, the first thing I recommend is definitely enabling read line. It makes a massive difference in terms of using the REPL. And then after that, you even get parent matching, which is lovely if you're kind of doing deep indentation. So yeah, the standard REPL, skip that. Anyway, so I guess that's the first thing to do. And I guess at that point, it might be kind of worth talking. I'm not 100% sure whether it's worth talking about this, because again, this is super introductory, but basically kind of the Guile REPL comes with some meta commands, which are super useful. And they kind of are prefixed with a comma. So you have help, which is basically just kind of a contextual help command, I guess. There's apropos, which is much like apropos on the shell, basically provides you with kind of a search through kind of loaded bindings. Binding, which basically just displays all the bindings that are currently loaded. Describe, which is kind of like a way to interactively query the documentation strings from functions. Like Emacs, Lisp, and Python as well, and other languages, Guile basically allows you to add documentation strings directly to procedures, so you can query those like this. And there's pretty print, which is quite useful when you're just interactively debugging or messing around. And finally, module and reload are basically just kind of shorthand commands for kind of loading new libraries that are already installed in the system. So, I don't know. I should probably start my REPL first. There you go. So apropos just lists them up, and then I can say, okay, well, let's find out what PROMAP does. So the D here stands for describe. Doesn't have documentation string. Okay, let's go for, there we go. So that's just a nice way to kind of, at the REPL, get some extra information. I can load let's go for and actually module kind of switches into a new module. So right now I'm kind of inside the Surfy1 module. Surfy1 is like just a really useful general purpose kind of scheme library that adds lots of wonderful things for processing lists and so on. So from here I could then say, binding, and I can actually have a look at all the procedures essentially that this module provides. So it's kind of a way to just at the REPL explore your kind of code base essentially, or your procedures and stuff. So yeah, meta commands, quite useful. But actually, when you're actually working on a project, of course, you kind of you've got your REPL that you kind of can interactively play with, but most of the time you're working in a text editor presumably. So, and most text editors will support the kind of syntax highlighting for scheme. So in GNOME, using gedit is fine. You can see pretty syntax highlighting, and you can just edit from here. So. Yay, it's nice and cloudy out there. So running, obviously, script files as well, just with a S flag in the invocation. But yeah, let's face it, it's still pretty bare bones. It's not an ideal development environment. So really, at the moment, the way to develop Guile projects is in Emacs. Emacs in general is a great text editor, and for editing, Guile is basically the way to go. So the first thing you want to do is install Emacs and Geyser. In Debian, it's both, again, like most major distributions probably have both of them packaged. In Debian, the usual commands. In Geeks, you can also do it with the usual commands for Geeks. And then you can just open your Guile script. So I've got it open here. And then the cool thing is that you can basically execute run Guile, and then you basically get your REPL inside Emacs. And at that point, basically, you have inside Emacs without any tweaking, like the better version of the REPL with a kind of a history, with backward search or whatever you want to do. So that REPL already is a pretty massive improvement. But then it's not just the REPL. I mean, you get the standard meta commands as well. So of course they work from within here, because this is just a wrapper around the kind of the actual Guile process that's running in the background. So it's a fully featured REPL out of the box. But you get also more stuff. You get like within the buffer kind of evaluation of Guile code. Much like if you've used Emacs before, like evaluating eLisp within buffers is something that you can totally do, and that's the same with Guile as well, basically. The experience of programming Guile in Emacs essentially becomes very much the same as programming eLisp in Emacs. So you can do live coding, you get immediate access to doc strings, and because kind of the Guile documentation is written in info or tech info, you can basically immediately access that at your fingertips as well from within Emacs. So let's look at this one here. I've loaded this file. I've got my REPL open, basically. I'm going to go for Guile eval buffer. And what it's done basically is just kind of taken this buffer and just evolved it in the REPL. You don't actually see the output, but it's done it. And the reason that I know that is, for example, if I now hover over this procedure here and I use Ctrl-C, D, I basically can immediately access the documentation for it, the doc string in this case. But for, let's say, match, which is a built-in kind of, well, it's actually exported by the match library. I can do the same thing against CDD, and then I should be able to, hopefully it works, click on the manual, and there we go. I go to the right chapter in the manual and I immediately get full documentation to that, which again beats my experience of working with Perl and PHP, of manually having to look up various things. So that's one thing. The other thing as well is, as I start writing, obviously, like editing text in Emacs or Lisp in Emacs is so much better than any other text editor that I've come across. So the whole kind of, it's yeah, by comparison, working in Gedit or something like that is painful. Can we see it? Only the mini buffer is hidden. Just 1 second, I'm just going to resize things a little bit more. And a little bit more. It refuses to become smaller. Down here is the famous, out of sight is the famous Emacs mini buffer, which if you've used Emacs you probably know about. In having Guile enabled, basically, it gives you, whilst you're typing, I can see it here, it's wonderful. It gives you basically like the procedure signatures as you're typing them. So basically you can immediately there see what kind of arguments the procedure expects, which is super useful again. So that's the other thing. We can basically evaluate procedure calls from within the buffer. So I'm now basically pressing Ctrl-X-E, and you can see basically it immediately evaluates in the kind of buffer next to it. So this is what I meant before with like basically buffer evaluation and live coding. You can essentially just write a new procedure definition inside the buffer, and then evaluate it, and then immediately test it from within the buffer without having to switch over to a different kind of test situation or running the script and hoping that everything works out fine. Which is, I don't know, just great. It just feels really nice to work that way. So there are a whole host of kind of geyser commands. The most important ones are probably like eval, buffer, and go, which is basically like evaluate the buffer and then kind of switch to the REPL where you have access to the stuff. So again, in the REPL I have access to my functions that I'm defining. There is Guile eval last sexp, which basically is like, it just like, that's what I did before. It just kind of evaluates the last kind of S expression that you are at. And I guess Geyser eval region is quite useful as well. Just mark a region and evaluate that. So basically allows you to stay within your kind of code file and just kind of evaluate partial parts of the code to kind of see, you see something goes wrong, you kind of quickly tweak it and you evaluate it again, see if it works then. It's a really nice way of working basically. So yeah, way better than the standard REPL and the standard text editor. So working on a larger project, I mean, basically we kind of have pretty good stuff, like what I've shown so far is pretty good stuff to kind of work on scripts and so on, single contained files. To work on a project, essentially, by and large, this kind of would be, I think, probably a representative kind of layout for a kind of Guile project. You'd basically have your folder, which is kind of the project name essentially. Within that, you might have another folder, which is kind of called the same, and that kind of contains support-like modules for your project. And then you've got your main kind of project file, let's say, and then you've got a tests folder with some test files in it. And of course, basically, like in Guile, you basically define modules with the define module form at the top of kind of a module file. And it basically names the module and it kind of exports procedures and you kind of define what modules you're using. And of course, if you have a project which kind of has several layers of directories deep, as you're working on the project in Geyser, you want to be able to use all the procedures that you've defined deeper down in your project. And the way to do that basically is, well, if you try to do that just normally, you're essentially going to get an error in Geyser because Geyser basically loads Guile from within the load path, and the load path by default does not contain your project file. So really, you need to basically, that's the only thing you need to remember when you're kind of working on a project in Guile with Geyser, is to basically use the Geyser add to load path command. Ooh. And by default, it will just kind of assume the directory that you're in. And then from now onwards, let's switch to my other example. Nope, my other example. There we go. So yeah, I'm just quickly going to switch to my REPL and restart it. Okay. Okay, so right now it's a fresh REPL. I have not done the add to load path thing yet. So if I do this, it will say, well, that code doesn't exist. It's not in the load path because it doesn't know about the project. So instead, I'm just going to quickly run the add to load path command. And now it's working fine. And now basically this, so I'm using the kind of GDEM support module, which is in GDEM support. It kind of is really simple, doesn't do much. But there's a procedure there called text to greeting, and you can see that this one uses here. So I can evaluate that, and I can do the same thing again. It's a different implementation of the same program. It's still cloudy because it's Belgium. And it works again. So, and that's basically how you can basically work on projects in Guile. You just add to load path. Thank you. So yeah, conclusion. Basically, really the way to work at the moment on Guile projects is using the interactive REPL as Geyser inside Emacs, together with live coding in buffers, and then kind of access to info documentation. That's by far the best way to work on it. And that's kind of what I wanted to cover in my introduction. So I don't know, like I think it's worth maybe like thinking about. Well, first of all, if you have comments or questions, I'm more than happy to kind of talk a little bit about things that maybe I went through too fast or whatever. But if not, I have a few comments as well, possibly about I think where Guile should go in order to kind of make it slightly more user-friendly. But I think a lot of that has been talked about already previous year and also in Ricardo's presentation, for instance, and John's presentation as well a little bit. But yeah, first of all, anyone any comments or questions? Yeah?
Will Guile ever replace Emacs with in-mainline Emacs?
That question is slightly outside of the remit of my presentation. I don't know. I think there's some awesome work that exists. And if you're on GeeksSD, actually, you can install Guile Emacs, which actually uses basically Guile as a backend for Emacs implementation. Right, yeah, mainline, exactly, yeah. So, don't know. There's, depending who you talk to, there's more or less excitement about it. A lot of people in Emacs, probably quite understandably, are very concerned about the, it's a massive project basically, and are quite concerned about the amazing stability that Emacs has and what the consequences would be. On the other hand, there's some really cool, it's just an inspiring project in a way. So we'll see what happens. That's my personal opinion. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Do you use any other IDE-like feature, like debugger?
Well, so.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Oh, of course. Sorry. So, do I use any kind of other IDE features like debuggers or things like that? So, by and large, I am one for more or less in like basically script-based debugging mostly, though, and that's kind of the technique that I use most of the time. But for Guile, I mean, there's a debugger that's built into the REPL as well. So with Gazier, you basically do get access to the Guile debugger as well. I didn't want to go into that at all in this presentation because it's kind of a talk in itself, really, like how to use it. But yeah, from within Emacs, you have access to that debugger, and you can do debugging that way. Other IDE-like features, I mean, autocomplete and code completion and code jumping and stuff like that. Is pretty much all available via Gazier as well. You can combine Gazier with company mode, which basically gives you auto-completion. Code jumping is by default enabled with Gazier. And there's also other, and this is the thing with Emacs, right? There's a million different ways to do it. So the way that I do kind of, for example, project management in Emacs is using a little file called projectile, which basically allows you to switch to projects and just kind of look at the files within that project. So it's quite nice.
Alex, I think on the mailing list and Geekchain there's been a discussion whether we should provide, sort of a nice environment in Emacs to do all this stuff.
Yeah.
Now we have to do it, stepwise by hand.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really valid point. I mean, there are Emacs flavors that are specifically directed towards people's workflows. I mean, the well-known one are things like Spacemacs. It's just kind of Emacs for people who come from Vim and just want to continue using Vim in Emacs, essentially. Personally, I use Evil and kind of have a heavy customized version of Emacs. But I think there's no reason why we couldn't do something similar for, have basically Emacs, like an Emacs flavor that's basically set up to out-of-the-box provide a friendlier IDE environment for Guile development that, maybe is like more accessible to people who don't come from a Vim or Emacs background. So like, actually provide the CUA compatibility mode by default, provide Gazier installed by default and working, things like that. And then basically we can just say to people, if you want to start hacking on Guile, just install this flavor of Emacs and you're good to go. I forgot to repeat the question. The question was, can we make it easier, essentially, to make Guile hacking possible in Emacs? Summary.
Kind of discussed this already last night, but I'm going to bring it up again anyway. What do you think of the idea of providing something like a Dr. Racket type thing, but for Guile?
Yeah, so the question is, what do I think of the idea of providing a Dr. Racket style thing, but for Guile? I would think that's amazing. I mean, Dr. Racket is basically an IDE and development environment for Racket, essentially. That is pretty much how people start programming Racket, by and large. And I think that kind of tooling would be amazing to have for Guile. And that's actually probably what my, slight problems about not getting, problems getting into Guile. Basically, we don't have that kind of really nice, I'm a new person, I want to learn about Guile. This is the tool for you to use. Like, we don't have that kind of nice standalone IDE, and I think it would be amazing to have it. The question is just kind of how do we do it? Or, where do we get the energy to do it? That's more the question. Any other questions? Okay, yeah, so I would just kind of want to add that I think like Chris has started on this as well, like I think having a nice kind of interactive tutorial or kind of user journey or story for people who kind of start using Guile would be really nice to have as well. Because the documentation for Guile is absolutely amazing, but it's definitely more of a kind of reference documentation rather than kind of a, this is Guile, it's an awesome language, and try out, go with us on this journey, and at the end of it, you'll be a Guile hacker, essentially. And I think it would be really nice to be able to provide people with that as well. Also, like one of the downsides that I think at the moment Guile has really is, and we've already talked about that a little bit at the panel, I think Ludovic mentioned it, that basically, like other cool and hip languages have language-specific package managers, which have pros and cons. One of the pros is that it becomes so much easier to kind of discover code that is out there and just installing it and using it. And Guile doesn't have that at the moment, and it's a shame because there's like tons of code out there that no one knows about. And Geeks to a certain extent does address that, but I mean, Geeks is a bit heavy for just like, if you're just interested in just, you know, just Guile packages, Geeks is a bit heavy probably. So yeah. That's all I have. If you are interested in kind of getting help, like you're just starting to work on Guile and you're kind of interested in getting help, the IRC chat is really user-friendly. My name is Athea on there, although I'm not very often on there, I must say. The mailing list is super nice as well. Documentation is fantastic. And some of us hang out on Twitter. Finally, before I leave the place here, we're organizing a GNU Hackers meeting this summer. Anyone and all are welcome to come. It's a really cool thing. It's like 3 days. In Germany it's this time. And basically, you should check it out, that URL, and sign up if you're interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex.